Drones have changed not only the battlefield itself, but modern military doctrine as a whole. Unmanned systems are far cheaper than missiles, yet with the right level of quality and upgrades, they can still hit high-value targets deep in the enemy's rear. Ukraine has carried out a number of such operations, and here we're presenting a reconstruction of one of the most impressive. In late summer of this year, multiple waves of drones struck and destroyed oil refineries, as well as warehouses and production facilities in the enemy's rear. This series of attacks is part of a much larger campaign aimed at stripping the occupier of the ability to finance and technically sustain the war. And the strikes on Ukraine's civilian cities, where the population continues to suffer. After sanctions were introduced, Russia has been able to fund its war against Ukraine largely through energy exports. That's why a natural target for Ukraine is the destruction of this economic potential. But how does a country fighting a brutal war for survival strike deep into the territory of the largest state on the planet? Let's break it down. They usually happen at night or in the early morning. Four objects are racing toward Moscow, slipping past even what many consider the most sophisticated air defense network on Earth. Moscow is genuinely well protected. Even by US standards, its air defense is often seen as close to impenetrable. But drones have rewritten the old rules. An S-400 radar operator thinks he's looking at birds on the screen. He's wrong. Those birds are made of metal, carrying warheads, and they're headed straight for Russia's largest oil refinery. But the deception couldn't last forever. Once the targets were under 100 kilometers from the objective, S-400 batteries detected the threat and reacted. Ukrainian UJ-26 drones, ironically nicknamed Beavers, sounding almost harmless, keep pushing towards the target. To catch and destroy them, 4 8N6DM interceptor missiles at their speed should need less than a minute. With a roar, they burst out of their launch tubes, accelerating to Mach 6 in seconds. But the drones aren't about to become easy prey for Russian air defenses. They immediately dropped to around 200 meters, slipping below the radar horizon. Russian interceptors, in turn, rely on radio command guidance during the initial and mid-course phases, and on the terminal phase, they can transition to a variant of what's essentially command guidance. That approach works great against missiles, but not against small, agile drones that can fly almost hugging the ground. The interceptors simply didn't have updated data on the drone's current position, only the last known location before the dive. As a result, the missiles ended up well above the drones and detonated harmlessly. But of course, a refinery this important had another layer of defense. Not one, but two Pantsir-S1 batteries. The Pantsir-S1 S-21E radar is powerful and precise. It's a high-tech system, but it was primarily designed to intercept larger targets. Its designers built it with incoming missiles in mind, not small drones. No matter how strong the radar signal is, tiny UAVs often don't generate a large enough return to produce a clear track. Operators saw intermittent blips and tried to cue their two A-38M cannons, but everything was happening too fast. Ukrainian planners built the operation down to a matter of seconds, and that tiny margin is exactly what the pilots exploited. They beat the enemy's guns by just a little, but it was enough to land the strike. Several drones carrying fairly powerful warheads hit the target. A total of 140,000 tons of oil went up in a massive, catastrophic blast, triggering a huge, extremely intense fire. Oil is highly flammable. Once the chain reaction starts, it can wipe out a large portion of the stored reserves. The entire western section of this major refinery, an area the size of a giant city block, was torn apart by the shockwave and flames in less than 2 minutes. That's what happens when thick black fuel burns at around 1,000 degrees Celsius. So how long does it take to put out a fire like that? 2 days? 3? One strike cut fuel supply into Moscow by more than a third, hitting the normal flow for Europe's largest megacity. And that was only the beginning. About 470 kilometers away, more than a dozen drones were already heading toward another target. After receiving the alert about the first strike, the Russians prepared to defend other likely objectives. Pantsir-S1 batteries at the Kuibbishevk refinery tracked the incoming threat. The defense was set up intelligently. The batteries were positioned in a triangular formation to cover each other's blind spots. They could engage from any direction and deliver accurate, rapid fire against multiple targets. Each system's radar could track roughly 24 drones. Engagement range reached up to 20 kilometers. A Pantsir-S1 can engage 4 targets at once, then immediately switch to the next set. On paper, that looks almost impossible to break through. But the Russians were in for a surprise. About a third of the drone group suddenly climbed a few hundred meters, making themselves easy prey. The radar's classification system automatically issued a priority alert, reporting what it interpreted as the sudden appearance of a cruise missile. But it was a carefully staged trap. Ukrainian pilots had studied the enemy's air defense procedures and used the system's own strengths against it. To pull this off, the climbing drones deployed corner reflectors. Their returns blended together and shifted in a way that mimicked a cruise missile. It took skilled piloting and real experience, but the trick was worth it. The Pantsir's computer saw cruise missiles, and the lead battery commander had about 2 seconds to decide. Maybe he suspected a deception. But what if it really was a missile attack? The protocol was clear, and the safest choice was to follow it. So within a little over 10 seconds, dozens of 9M335 missiles were fired. They used radar command guidance. The interceptors accelerated, but before they could reach the target, the drones began dropping the reflectors at 1 or 2 second intervals. The radar suddenly saw new targets appearing while the previous ones fell away. It looked like the targets were multiplying. The missiles were completely thrown off. They could end up chasing decoys. Or maybe they managed to hit a couple of drones. From the diversion group, it didn't really matter. Either way, a weapon system costing millions failed to stop the raid, and most of the main strike group flew straight through. 8 drones were racing in at just 50 meters altitude, and they ended up behind the Pantsir's radar. The Ukrainians exploited a known weakness, a blind spot in the phased array antenna. The blind zone is small, but the drones used it successfully, proving they can plan and calculate every element of the fight with precision. It felt like a chess match. There was no time to swing the turret around. The drones were barely more than a kilometer away. The 9M335 missiles could still deal with the threat, but they need about 1.5 seconds after launch to arm their proximity fuses. That's too slow. The drones are already almost on top of the target. The last option was the Pantsir's twin 30mm 2A38M cannons. They opened fire instantly. Each barrel fires at up to 2,500 rounds per minute. The system calculated lead angles, but the drones kept making rapid, constant altitude changes, bouncing between roughly 40 and 80 meters. The Pantsir fire control computer relies on predictive targeting, but the drones' altitude shifts were randomized. Most of the drones survived the barrage, and 3 of them were closing in on the refinery's most vulnerable, most flammable sections. Meanwhile, all 3 Pantsir batteries were reloading at the same time. A full reload takes about 5 to 7 minutes. In theory, the batteries should rotate their fire so they can cover each other. But here, the system had a gap. For roughly a minute and a half, the refinery was exposed, and Ukrainian pilots exploited it to the fullest. 3 direct hits inflicted massive damage, destroying not only an oil reserve large enough to supply a small city, but also storage tanks, equipment, and key logistics infrastructure. The third wave, 6 UJ-26 Beavers, was heading toward Voronezh. But suddenly they went blind as GPS disappeared instantly. The Russians had switched on a Krasuka-4 electronic warfare system. It floods a huge portion of the electromagnetic spectrum across a very wide band, roughly from 0.1 to 18 gigahertz. Can you push through that kind of jamming? Not really. The jammer operates with massive directional power, around 500 watts, while a GPS signal is on the order of about 0.025 watts. The EW output overwhelms the signal by a ridiculous margin, like comparing the strength of an elephant to a squirrel. The drones had contingency programming for exactly this situation. They automatically switched to inertial navigation systems. You can't jam that kind of navigation with electronic warfare, but it comes with a much larger error margin. Under these conditions, the drones could have missed by several hundred meters, which would have made all the pilots' effort and the entire Voronezh operation pointless. Fortunately, reconnaissance made the difference. The oil there was stored in 3 tanks. Together they formed a distinctive geometric pattern that became a visual reference point for the lead drone's navigation. Imperfect, but effective enough. That made it possible to guide the strike with an error of well under 10 meters. The target data was carried by 1 drone, but the others didn't have it because of the Krasuka's jamming. Luckily, the jammer's effectiveness fluctuated depending on frequency. On one channel, a tiny gap opened for a split second, just enough to transmit data. The drone managed to send the target coordinates and the strike timing. The other 5 UAVs corrected course. Within minutes, the refinery was engulfed in flames. If the Krasuka-4 was positioned within the blast radius of the shockwave, then that roughly $20 million EW vehicle with its extremely powerful jamming suite had little chance of surviving. And even if it did, the Voronezh refinery still took a devastating hit. But it doesn't end there. Another drone group was already racing toward the final and most heavily defended target, the Primorsko-Akhtarsk military airfield. To protect the refineries, the Russians had given them decent defenses, but this airbase was built from the ground up as a modern fortress. Recon reported that it was protected by 4 Tor-M2 surface-to-air missile systems, positioned optimally with overlapping fields of fire. 2 modern, heavily armed Su-35 supersonic fighters were patrolling at around 8,000 meters. Every radar was operating at peak efficiency. Multiple tracking systems, different types, perfectly layered, worked together for detection, tracking, and, of course, fire control. The Russians were well prepared to defend the site, but the Ukrainians knew exactly who they were dealing with, and they did their homework too. 8 UJ-22s are flying in, constantly weaving. If each drone had a comet tail, the formation would look like a snake because they're moving along a winding, irregular path. That burns more fuel, and fuel is already limited at these long ranges and extends total flight time. At first glance, flying like this looks like a mistake, but it's more complex than that. The Ukrainians know Russian Tor-M2 systems use command guidance with predicted intercept points. The fire control computer models a target's movement using a Kalman filter. And Kalman filters assume relatively smooth, consistent behavior. Every sudden deviation forces the system to recalculate. When drones weave side to side, you can still track them and lead the target for accurate fire. But over time, those small deviations start to accumulate inside the Russian computer's calculations. Once the Ukrainian drones entered engagement range, all 4 Tor M2 systems opened fire at once. Credit where it's due, the timing was excellent. 16-9 M338 missiles shot off the rails and accelerated to around Mach 2.5 on solid-fuel motors. The error that had built up from spoofing the computer ate into the guidance solution and reduced efficiency, but the missiles corrected and locked in, tracking their targets tightly. For a moment, it looked like the Ukrainian drones would be reduced to nothing but small fragments. But in the seconds it took the missiles to refine their intercept, the UAVs pulled an unexpected maneuver. They pitched up sharply and climbed hard, and the agile Russian missiles had no trouble following. Several drones were destroyed. Did all that effort end up being wasted? Not at all. Those maneuvers forced every Russian sensor and tracking asset to focus on that one engagement. And while the defenders were locked onto the obvious fight, the airbase missed an Uter from another direction. 4 UJ-26 Beavers crossed the coastline after flying just under 800 kilometers over the Sea of Azov at the lowest altitude possible. Their target was the Shahed storage hangars, and at that moment, they were completely exposed. Dozens of Shahed 136 drones, built on Iranian technology, the same type Russia regularly uses to strike Ukrainian cities. Each Shahed carries a warhead with roughly 40 kilograms of explosive, and each one holds about 50 liters of fuel. Put several dozen of those drones inside a single hangar, and there are multiple hangars like that. Now imagine what happens when all that explosive material goes up at once after a precise hit from Ukrainian UAVs. The hangars storing Russia's drones were essentially wiped off the map by a chain of massive blasts that lit up the pre-dawn sky in a series of flashes. The operation took weeks to plan and lasted several hours in execution. But the detonation sequence itself unfolded in just about a minute and a half. That was enough for Russia to lose around 200 drones, with a total value of roughly $5 million. Even 2 Su-35s couldn't prevent it. Primorsko-Akhtarsk took a brutal hit, and for a while, Ukrainian cities will be able to sleep a little more peacefully. The operation could have been considered a success if it ended right there, but there was one final touch. 2 modified UJ-26 Beavers reached Penza, a city more than 600 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. How is that possible if the Beaver's standard range is about 350 kilometers? The answer is the modification. Extra fuel tanks were installed in the warhead compartment, sacrificing some striking power. That pushed the range out to roughly 980 kilometers, and the remaining payload was still more than enough to put on a fireworks show. The problem was that a Russian Su-35 had been hunting them for almost half an hour. Once you fly that deep into enemy territory, staying completely unnoticed just isn't realistic. The fighter's radar was tuned specifically to track targets like these. At this point, neither surprise nor small size could save the drones. And of course, they had no high-end defensive tools, no flares, no jammers. It looked like the outcome was decided. The Russian pilot fired 2 R-77 missiles. They use active radar homing, and their warheads are more than powerful enough to wipe out the entire drone group. The Su-35 turned back toward base. There was no point burning more fuel. The missiles would finish the job. The R-77s accelerated and closed the distance in seconds. When they were about 10 kilometers from the drones, their seekers went active. And that's when the drones started changing direction even more aggressively than before. The missiles could still hold lock, but the guidance error kept accumulating. Both missiles detonated slightly early, just before the point where they needed to for a clean kill. The first one still got close enough. The blast was tight enough for fragments to destroy one drone. But the second detonation happened too far away, and the second Ukrainian drone kept flying. Even if the Russians realized one drone had survived, there was no time left to react. The UAV punched through the roof of a workshop where semiconductors were being produced, and 15 kilograms of explosives detonated. The blast wasn't as spectacular as some of the other strikes, but it did what mattered most. It disrupted an extremely fragile, finely tuned high-tech production process. Expensive equipment worth millions of dollars, and nearly impossible to replace or repair under sanctions, was damaged or destroyed. Nearly finished chips were burned. Rooms that had once been sterile were now filled with debris and dust. One precise hit, and chip production for military equipment deep inside Russia was effectively paralyzed for anywhere from 6 months to a year. The Kremlin has other facilities like this, but now Russian supply chains and logistics will face serious strain. And other legitimate military targets deep in the rear will become even harder to protect. Over the past few months, Ukraine has delivered a series of serious blows to key nodes in Russia's military-industrial base. Knocking out oil refineries cuts into the Kremlin's main source of funding for the army, and strikes on military bases and technology production sites steadily erode the occupiers' quantitative advantage in weapons, while helping protect Ukraine's civilian cities from further attacks. The precise details of these operations aren't publicly known, because information about missions this unique has to remain classified. But their outcomes are known, along with several key aspects that allow us to reconstruct the most powerful strikes. To do that, we carefully analyzed the limited open-source data available, compared the forces involved, and looked at the tactical and technical characteristics of the weapon systems known to have been used. Based on that, we built the most plausible reconstruction of what happened. If you like our work, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And beyond reconstructions, we also break down major, widely documented military operations that are shaping the modern battlefield and history itself. Plus, we analyze the latest developments in military technology. Stay with us.